Ahoy! Hashtag Zach here. Today I'm going to tell you all about the Vietnam War. In the United States, there's a lot of cultural baggage that comes along with the Vietnam War. The civil rights movement, the flower power anti-war protests, Watergate, all causing a lot of social tensions in our country. I'm going to ignore all of that and just look at the Vietnam War from a perspective of military strategy and overall historical significance. Any history of conflict in Vietnam has to go back to French Indochina, the period where this was a rubber plantation for France. After they fought a vicious civil war for independence, the region of Tonkin gained the northern half of Annam and became North Vietnam. Laos and Cambodia became independent, and the remaining territories became South Vietnam. In Laos, the rugged terrain prevented any government from having much control over the territories. However, in Cambodia, the exact opposite happened. The communist regime under Pol Pot began ethnic cleansing, a form of genocide. North Vietnam fell under the control of a man named Ho Chi Minh, who, although being very educated and a very good leader, began to exploit the Cold War conflict between the US and the Soviet Union in order to gain a lot of economic and military support from Russia. This had a lot of good impacts on his country's infrastructure. However, it made the US perceive North Vietnam as a possible communist aggressor state. It is debated to this day to what extent communism had control over North Vietnam, and to what extent Ho Chi Minh was just trying to get military and infrastructure support from the Soviet Union, and was exploiting the Cold War tensions just as a motivator to get the Soviet Union to provide more help than they would have otherwise given. It's not really known, but what we do know is that Ho Chi Minh was a dictator who also, like Cambodia, employed ethnic cleansing, a form of genocide, in order to retain control. The government of South Vietnam was not much better than the government of North Vietnam. However, it did not practice ethnic cleansing and actually was beginning to have reforms to increase openness with the world, such as free trade and freer elections. However, these elections still aren't free by our standards today. There's a lot of criticism of the US at this point because it kind of looks like we're just supporting one ruthless dictator at the expense of another ruthless dictator. But that's not 100% how it was. Take Korea for an example. If you look at how it was in the early 1950s, during the Korean War, South Korea did not look much better than North Korea. However, if you look at them now, South Korea is a functioning democracy that has entered the first world in terms of riches, while North Vietnam is still backwards, corrupt, and communist. A similar thing could have possibly happened with Vietnam, but we can't know for sure. This is where the Vietcong comes in. It was an entirely separate entity from North Vietnam, but it wished to see a united Vietnam under the North. So now the stage is set. The United States is backing South Vietnam in its pursuit of being a stable democracy, and in the North, there is a Vietnam that is communist, backed by the Soviet Union, and has the Viet Cong as its support. 1965 is where the violence begins in earnest, with the Viet Cong using the instability in Laos and Cambodia to infiltrate into South Vietnam and cause unrest, fighting as insurgents, guerrilla warfare, which is basically hiding in the trees and shooting at a more powerful opponent and using concealment and stealth to your advantage. The United States begins its involvement heavily by sending the U.S. Army along with certain elements of the Air Force and Navy. Now this is where the United States makes a major strategic blunder. Instead of taking the fight to their opponent by attacking North Vietnam as well as combating the Viet Cong in South Vietnam, the U.S. decides to hunker down in South Vietnam and just sit around and wait for attackers to come to them, where they will then defeat them. It does not go well for the U.S. and leads to a lot of casualties, fighting over the same ground again and again without any real progress. the US began waiting for the opponent to win or give up, and this isn't really an effective strategy. A major obstacle for the US's success in Vietnam was fear of Chinese involvement. Chinese involvement had happened in the Korean War, with the Chinese sending millions of troops into Korea and preventing the US from having a decisive victory. The United States was terrified that a similar thing would happen, and so really handled the situation with kid gloves and was not decisive in any way, just to avoid Chinese involvement. This shows one of the major misunderstandings the United States had about the Cold War at this time. We viewed all the communist governments around the world as a united front against us, but this wasn't the case. This was after the Sino-Soviet split, basically where Chinese and Russian communists were set against each other and actually started militarizing their borders, fearing a war. This was not a situation where China would go and help the communists that were allied with the Soviet Union. In fact, they might have even been sympathetic to our cause in this. However, this is another hotly debated topic because we just don't know. Most of the fighting of the Vietnam War took place in the Mekong River Delta in the southern part of South Vietnam. In spite of the US not taking any strategic initiative and only waiting for their enemies to come to them, their military superiority still allowed the United States to destroy every attack that the Vietcong and the North Vietnamese launched. A notable example of this is the Tet Offensive in 1968, where the Vietcong launched massive attacks across all of South Vietnam against major military and political targets. It was seen as a disastrous defeat by the United States military because the Vietcong were able to attack so many targets at once, but really, it was a sign of victory because the United States soundly defeated every single attack and crippled the Viet Cong beyond repair. The Viet Cong would not be a major military force for the rest of this conflict. In 1969, the new president of the United States, Richard Nixon, employed a new strategy against North Vietnam. It combined more aggressive attacks against the Viet Cong supply lines in Laos and Cambodia with direct heavy bombing in North Vietnam against the North Vietnamese military. This approach actually forced North Vietnam to the negotiating table for peace for the first time in the entire war, and by 1972 had actually gotten them to agree to peace terms, and there was temporary peace. However, in 1975, when rogue elements of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese military decided to test South Vietnam and America's commitment to holding to the treaty, there was no response from the United States Congress to offer the funds that they had promised, so North Vietnam saw no reason to just annex South Vietnam then and there. This is a stunning reversal. The United States won every major military confrontation of the entire war, and despite having some errored strategy at the beginning, came back and won, getting a favorable peace treaty at the end. Pulling out of Vietnam is a defeat that embarrasses the United States to this day, and also left its scars on the Vietnam itself, as after the South Vietnam fell to the north, there was a major refugee crisis of many Vietnamese fleeing to anywhere they could, and Ho Chi Minh conducted ethnic cleansing, killing 6 million South Vietnamese civilians after the United States left. I hope this video taught you something new you didn't know about the Vietnam War, and that it encourages you to look up more information on your own. Please comment, like, subscribe, and come back for future videos.